Hey guys, welcome back to another Destiny 2 video. Today's video is the first build guide for Season 21, and it features Arc Titan, mainly because of an exotic armor piece that got reworked, but also because of the seasonal mods having some really good benefits for basically all Arc builds. A few highlights of the build include using point contact cannon brace to basically jolt everything within a 15-meter radius. We have tons of blinding effects that we can take advantage of, meaning that we also have a ton of utility behind this build as well. We also have survivability, buffing our damage resistance from multiple sources, and our just general health regen. If you like what you saw here today, be sure to like and subscribe for more Destiny 2 content like this. I already have a few other build guides in the works, so stay tuned for those. And let me know what you thought of the build down below, as well as any recommendations or questions you might have about it. Onto our subclass. Starting off with our super, you can really use either Fist of Havoc or Thunder Crash. It doesn't matter which one you choose. I'm personally using Fist of Havoc because of the buff it got at the start of Season 21, as well as the blinding utility that it has behind its heavy slam. But again, if you want a faster cooldown and a sort of higher burst DPS super, Thunder Crash is more than viable with this build. For your abilities, you can use any kind of barricade or class ability that you want to. I personally use Thruster just because of its lower cooldown. However, if you want to use a rally barricade or towering barricade, you can. Just keep in mind it's going to cut down on the mobility that this build has to offer with Thruster, as well as the faster cooldowns. For your melee, you're going to go with Thunderclap, 1 for its lower cooldown and 2 for its compatibility with point contact cannon brace. The other melees could have actually been used with it in the past, but there is a slight tweak that they made to point contact that I'll get into whenever I go over the armor specifically. For your grenade, I highly recommend you use the Pulse Grenade, just because we're going to be taking advantage of its ability to generate ionic traces through our aspect. For aspects, the first is Touch of Thunder, which is going to enhance our grenade depending on which one we choose. For Pulse Grenades, it creates ionic traces that periodically generate as we damage a target over time. These ionic traces will seek us out, and whenever we pick them up, it'll grant us ability energy. There are going to be a number of ways we can actually generate these ionic traces, and because of that, not only is it going to allow us to have stacks of armor charge thanks to a new mod that was introduced, but it's also going to allow us to have constant ability regen across the board that we can stack on top of other effects. For the other aspect, we're going to be using Knockout. Basically, whenever you critically wound an enemy or break their shield, your melee has increased range and damage for a short amount of time, and in general, whenever you defeat a target with a melee, it makes you amplified and starts your health regeneration. Now, it's worth noting that Knockout is only 6 seconds long, and you can't refresh it, meaning that after 6 seconds, you lose Knockout, but because of how easy it is to get melee kills and just general arc kills with this build, thus allowing us to critically wound or break a target shield, we'll basically always have Knockout active and always have a way to take advantage of it. Finally, onto the fragments, the ones I would highly recommend using are as follows. The first is Spark of Ions, where defeating a jolted target creates an ionic trace, and we have multiple ways to jolt targets with this build, so this is a fantastic way to generate ionic traces. I'm also using Spark of Amplitude, and this one I highly recommend regardless of what combination of fragments you use. Rapidly defeating targets while you are amplified will create an orb of power, and since a lot of our build revolves around just general AoE or splash damage, this is a great way to basically double your orb of power gen just across the board. And again, these orbs of power help build our super energy and also benefit us through whatever armor charge mods we end up using. The next I'm using is Spark of Beacons. When we're amplified, our arc special weapon Final Blows will create a blinding explosion. You don't have to use this, and I'm mainly using it for the weapon I recommend using later on in the video. However, if you're interested, you can use a variety of other fragments, such as, for example, Spark of Shock, which will allow your arc grenade to jolt a target, which you can then take advantage of with something like Spark of Ions that I mentioned earlier. You could also use something like Spark of Magnitude to increase the duration of your pulse grenade. And then the final one is Spark of Resistance. Whenever you're surrounded by combatants, you are more resistant to incoming damage, providing us a nice damage resist buff on top of all the other sources that we can take advantage of. Briefly going over the artifact mods that I feel are important for this build. The first two are going to be authorized mods for Arc and Melee. These will basically just make the overall energy cost for Arc and Melee focused mods to be a lot lower, allowing you to stack on other stat boosting mods or just a higher combination of these mods that you couldn't normally do previously. We also have Electric Armor, which will basically allow you to stay amplified longer while you're on an Arc subclass. This is simply improving the duration of amplifying. It is a nice quality of life bonus for this build. The next mod is Thunderous Retort, and I highly recommend you use this. Basically, while you're amplified or when you're critically wounded, meaning that your shields are depleted, when you cast your super, during the duration of that super cast, you will have a 35% damage buff applied to your Arc super. This is great on Titan in particular because both Thunder Crash and Fist of Havoc can be buffed by Thunderous Retort, meaning that as long as you're using a build like this where you'll always be amplified, your Arc super will always deal 35% more damage. We also have Amped Up, which gives us damage resistance while we're amplified. The fact that we're combining it with Spark of Resistance along with our base damage resistance, even if it's something like 10%, it is going to make a noticeable difference. Finally, onto our last two mods. The first one is Lightning Strikes Twice. After you throw an arc grenade, you gain an increased grenade charge regeneration for a short period of time, and any arc kill that you get will actually refresh and increase the duration of that benefit. One thing I do want to note though is lightning strikes twice isn't just a flat discipline increase, it stacks even at max discipline. The final mod is Shock and Awe. Arc Final Blows while you are amplified summon a burst of lightning that damages and jolts targets. Basically, after getting a periodic number of Final Blows or just a certain duration of it, it'll call down one singular lightning strike which will hit the target, deal around the same damage that our lightning strikes will actually do from point contact cannon brace. Through my testing, it's every 5 or even 6 kills, and sometimes I went periods of 6 or 7 seconds while getting multiple Arc Final Blows before this actually activated again. Finally, onto the armor and the mods. For a helmet, I'm first using a stack of Harmonic Siphon, which allows any arc weapon final blow that we get to periodically generate us an orb of power. I'm also stacking this with hands-on, which allows our melee kills to get us increased super regeneration. And I'm pairing this with a special ammo finder just to support the weapon I'm primarily using alongside this build whenever I can't spam my abilities. If you want to swap this out for a heavy ammo finder, for example, or another stack of Siphon or hands-on, you can absolutely do that instead. Next up is our gauntlets, and for our exotic, I'm using point contact cannon brace. Like I mentioned at the start of the video, these technically got a slight rework and a massive buff to them at the start of Season 21, and have gone from what I consider to be one of the worst exotics on Titan in general to being one of the best specifically for Arc Titan. Whenever you defeat a target with your Thunderclap, it restores your melee energy, and any targets near what you hit with your Thunderclap then have lightning strikes dealt to them and they become jolted. And being amplified just increases the raw damage of these lightning strikes. One change I mentioned earlier though is that previously while you were amplified you could use your normal melee and still have these lightning effects proc. This no longer happens with point contact cannon brace as far as my testing goes, so that is a bit unfortunate, but I do understand the need to convert that if the lightning strikes were getting a complete overhaul and major buff. As far as the mods go though, I'm using 2 stacks of melee kickstart, and this is so whenever we use our actual melee ability, in this case Thunderclap, it'll grant us a ton of melee energy whenever we use it, and with 2 stacks of melee kickstart, we get a much higher effect than what would be provided just from one. Just by getting kills with our Thunderclap, we could have anywhere from 20 or 30% melee energy after we use it to just completely regenning our entire melee charge on a multi-kill. And this is excluding all the other ways that we can have melee regen intrinsically applied to us. I'm also using heavy-handed, which allows these melee kills to grant us orbs of power on final blows. One thing I do want to note is that this mod specifically mentions power melee final blows, so if you don't have your Thunderclap charged, you can actually just punch regularly as long as you have knockout, and this will actually still proc from it. For a chest piece, I'm personally using Charged Up, which allows the maximum number of armor charge stacks to increase to 4, starting from our base 3, and then I'm also reserving the other 2 spots for any resistance mods based on the activity we're doing. Onto our legs, the first mod I'm using is Absolution, and this allows us to get a small amount of ability energy for all of our abilities anytime we pick up an orb of power, helping our melee, grenade, and class ability regen that all feed into each other. And then I'm also using the new mod Elemental Charge. Whenever we collect a Fire Sprite, Ionic Trace, Stasis Shard, or Void Breach, or whenever we destroy a Strand Tangle, it has an escalating chance to grant us a stack of armor charge. This is just a nice quality of life addition because we're already generating so many Ionic Traces that because of this mod will now periodically grant us a stack of armor charge as well. And then the final mod I'm using is Recuperation, which whenever we pick up an orb of power, it grants us a small boost to our health. Normally using both of these orb of power mods might be a little bit difficult with this build, especially since I mentioned earlier that this is a ranged melee. However, this is all made a lot easier thanks to a newly added mod, Powerful Attraction. Whenever you use your class ability, any nearby orbs of power are automatically collected, and these orbs of power can grant us super energy or stacks of armor charge, and thanks to things like Recuperation, it'll grant us healing anytime we pick up an orb of power, and multiple orbs do grant you multiple effects of recuperation, as well as stuff like Absolution, which can also benefit all of our abilities as well as our thruster ability itself. On top of this, for our class item, we're also using Distribution, which means that whenever we initially use our thruster ability, we have increased regen for our grenade, melee, and class ability, and this does work with something like Absolution if we pick up orbs of power when we use it. On top of this, we're also utilizing Reaper, which after we use our class ability, our next final arc weapon blow will spawn in an orb of power guaranteed. Speaking of which, let's go over the arc weapons and general weapon loadout that I think works best for this build. Onto the weapons and my recommended loadouts for this build. You can really use any arc weapon through great effect, but these are the ones that I think work the best with the playstyle this build actually has to offer. The first one is Forbearance, which is the craftable waveframe arc grenade launcher from Valve Disciple. Now, Forbearance has a number of things that have it work really well with this build, and the first and foremost I feel is Soul Drinker, which you gain health based on the number of hits that you deal with this weapon before you reload. Since it's a waveframe GL that has a lot of other things that can enhance either its general AoE effects or just potency in PvE, Soul Drinker is a great way to make up for the lack of intrinsic healing that a lot of arc builds suffer from, and simply getting a hit on 1 or 2 adds is enough to give you 50% of your health back just for reloading this weapon. As far as the other weapon perks, I personally went with Enhanced Ambitious Assassin and Enhanced Golden Tricorn. Now the reason I went with Ambitious Assassin is just because simply getting a kill with this weapon and then reloading will allow it to have 2 in the magazine instead of 1, and this will just constantly keep carrying over as long as you're using this weapon. And just in case you're curious, both of the shots fired when Ambitious Assassin is procced will also benefit Soul Drinker. It's not just the last one you fire. The main reason we're going with Golden Tricorn over other effects like Enhanced Chain Reaction, for example, is because of the raw damage boost that it provides that is actually greater than using 3 surge mods to enhance this weapon alone. Plus, with this build already having a lot of ease of use when it comes to getting ability final blows, this was a no-brainer. After getting the first kill, this weapon will have a 15% damage buff for a short amount of time, and during that duration, as long as we get a melee or grenade final blow, which again is very easy for this build, this buff will turn into a 50% damage increase. And again, with something like Ambitious Assassin and the reload automatically healing you after you get hits, you can go on sprees with this weapon very easily. All the while you're amplified, this weapon will also generate you orbs of power, and on top of that, getting kills with Forbearance will generate an arc blinding explosion on kill thanks to Spark of Beacons. As far as other weapons go, you can always use something like the Aikilos SMG, which has been a staple for arc builds and just general PvE content in Destiny 2 for a while now. Another weapon I recommend is Path of Least Resistance, which is the craftable trace rifle from Season 20. I personally have Stats for All and Bolt Shot on it. My other recommendation is going to be Delicate Tomb, which was the seasonal exotic from Season of the Plunder. The main reason we're going to be using it is that final blows with this weapon have a chance to generate an Ionic Trace, which we already went over how that benefits this build already. With its catalyst specifically, anytime you collect an Ionic Trace, it partially reloads the magazine from reserves, and whenever you pair the catalyst with its other trait, Tempest Cascade, it allows that refill to also jolt the next shot that you fire, and whenever you jolt that target and get a kill with it, which is very easy to do with this weapon, it also generates an Ionic Trace thanks to our intrinsic fragments. This is the weapon I would personally use if your goal is just to jolt as many targets as you can with this build, as you're basically always going to have Tempest Cascade active. However, the big drawback is it does take up your exotic slot, and our melee already jolts a ton of targets very easily, so I don't feel that it's an absolute necessity with this build, but it is a fantastic exotic alternative if you want to use it. Onto the heavy weapons, and I have a few specific recommendations. The main one I'm going to recommend is Grand Overture, specifically with its catalyst. Grand Overture has some insane burst DPS potential when you build up the 20 rocket volley shots that you can get just by landing hits with this weapon. Pairing this with its catalyst, where the missile volley itself will blind combatants, and then any combatants defeated by this will then explode. This means that this can be an absolute monster in terms of raw DPS or just general ad clear. Pairing this with the already existing jolting and blinding effects that this build can take advantage of, this is a perfect fit that provides us a large burst DPS option and allows it to melt champions in Legend and Master content even while playing solo. If you want to use an exotic but don't like Grand Overture, you can also use Legend of Acreus, which got a huge buff to its reserves at the start of Season 21. It also has Trench Barrel, which when you land a melee hit, the next 3 shots will deal an absurd amount of damage. And then of course you can always use Thunderlord, which has been a staple for arc builds for a very long time now. Anyway guys, that's the build. Like I mentioned earlier, this build has some insane ability regen and jolting and blinding effect potential, as well as having some great survivability and raw damage output. I personally believe that this build is straight overkill for anything including or below legend content, and really master level content is where I see this build kind of hitting its ceiling as far as usage goes. It's one I'm definitely going to be rocking a lot during Season 21, and I hope you guys enjoyed if you try it out for yourself. Anyway guys, that's going to do it for the video. Thank you so much for watching and your continued support, and by the way, thank you all again for 10,000 subscribers. It really means a lot to me. Stay tuned for another Destiny 2 build guide coming in the near future, and I'll catch you all in the next one. Thank you, and have a great day.